In the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire was still extremely powerful, but the Europeans gradually became less afraid of it. It had failed in the late 17th century to take Vienna, and therefore its expansion on land was blocked. And in the late 18th century, it was defeated by the Russians. So European attitudes, instead of fear, gradually became characterized much more by a curiosity towards it. But the Turkish Empire was still very present in the Mediterranean, and the travellers in the Mediterranean lived in fear of Barbary corsairs, who were likely to, if they attacked them, to abduct them and take them to North Africa as captives, where they would stay until they were ransomed. Some never returned. Some were badly treated, although some did manage to make a career that would have been impossible for them in Europe, particularly, of course, amongst the poorer of these captives. However, there was another fear associated with the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean, and that was the plague. The plague had more or less disappeared from Europe after the last great outbreak, which started in Marseille in 1720. But it was known to be endemic in the Ottoman Empire, and all travellers to the Ottoman Empire mentioned it. And when they returned to Europe, they had to be quarantined in lazareti. So in people's minds, the plague was very much associated with the Ottoman Empire and with the Turks. The general explanation given for the fact that plague was endemic in the Ottoman Empire was partly due to the climate. It was particularly seen to be prevalent in Egypt, where it returned every year. But it was also associated with so-called Muslim fatalism. That is, the belief that individual destiny was decided by God, and it was very difficult to do anything about it. And a large number of European works repeated that because of this fatalistic attitude, the Turks did nothing to avoid the plague or to combat it. And they even went to visit people with the plague or wore clothes of people who died from the plague. And so even though they saw the precautions taken by the Europeans, which enabled them to escape from the plague, they therefore did nothing and accepted it. This connection between so-called Muslim fatalism and the plague is found in a large number of works, and in particular in a very influential late 17th century work on the Ottoman Empire by the Englishman Paul Rico, who was consul in Smyrna and a representative of the English Levant Company. His book on the Ottoman Empire was re-edited several times and republished in the late 17th century. It was translated into several languages, including French, and was particularly influential, including his description and analysis of Ottoman despotism, of which he gave a very clear definition, which was taken over, for example, by Montesquieu in the Esprit des Lois. And Montesquieu also copied Rico's connection between the plague and Muslim fatalism. It was also reproduced by Chevalier de Jaucourt in his article in the Encyclopédie on Turkey. And several other encyclopedia articles also mentioned this connection between the Turks and the Ottoman Empire, including in the article actually on the plague. So what we see here is a convenient link between the traditional enemy, and particularly its religion, with contagion and the encouragement of contagion. And I think we can see a certain number of parallels between today's situation amongst those who insist that COVID-19 is a Chinese disease. The paroxysm of this attitude comes in the later 18th century, when there was a sharp political division between those who were extremely hostile to the Ottoman Empire and considered that it should be expelled from Europe, and those, on the other hand, who saw it as a necessary barrier to Russian expansionism in the Mediterranean. Amongst those who was particularly hostile to the Ottomans was Constantin François Chassebeuf, known as Volney, a name he took in homage to Voltaire, who was, could be called a philosophe and an irreligious thinker. He visited Egypt and Syria in the early 1780s, and he wrote an extremely hostile account of these countries, published in 1787. And what he defended is a thesis which later on, in the 19th century, would be called the dead hand of the Turk. In other words, that wherever the Ottomans went or where they dominated, they spread desolation and misery, and they ruined the countries which they governed. Volney included in his later work on the Russo-Turkish War a diatribe against the Turks on passages on the plague, which was endemic, as I said, in the Ottoman Empire. Following the Baron Tott, who had been sent by the French government to Istanbul and published a very long and important memoir, also quite hostile, on the Ottoman Empire in 1784-5, he denied that the plague was in fact endemic to Egypt or Syria. For Volney, following Tott, it had its origin in Constantinople and arrived every year from Constantinople in his ships. But Volney went further than Tott, and in this work on the Russo-Turkish War, published in 1788, he more or less equated the Turks, what he considered as this evil empire, actually with the plague. And we find the following passage. Qui, jamais, avant les Ottomans, avait ouï parler sur la Méditerranée de lazaret et de peste? C'est avec ces barbares que sont venus ces fléaux. Ce sont eux qui, par leur stupide fanatisme, perpétuent la contagion en renouvelant ces germes. Ah, ne fût-ce que par ce motif, puissent périr leur gouvernement, puissent à leur place s'établir d'autres peuples, et que la terre et la mer soient affranchies de leur esclavage.